The sound came again, slightly louder this time, a dull, reverberating thud that seemed to originate from somewhere within the manor's interior. Miss Marple paused mid-rise, her teacup settling back onto its saucer with a soft clink. Around her, the garden party continued its pleasant murmur, largely indifferent to the noise. A door closing, perhaps, the wind catching something inside. Such were the innocent explanations that readily presented themselves to those not inclined to listen too carefully. But Miss Marple had spent 73 years listening very carefully indeed. She remained seated for another moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap, considering the matter with the same deliberate attention she might give to a particularly complicated piece of knitting. The stranger had entered the house approximately 7 minutes ago. Lady Ashford had preceded him by perhaps 12 minutes. The time interval suggested either coincidence or careful planning. Miss Marple suspected it was the latter. Caroline's trembling hands suggested she knew precisely what interval had been arranged. When Miss Marple finally rose, she did so without haste, acknowledging the polite nods of nearby acquaintances with the gentle courtesy that had become her trademark. To any observer, she was simply an elderly guest requiring a moment indoors, perhaps to freshen up or to find the powder room. Her progress toward the French doors was unhurried, her posture stooped in a manner that suggested fragility rather than purpose. No one paid her particular attention. The morning room was dim and cool after the brightness of the garden, and it took a moment for Miss Marple's eyes to adjust to the softer light filtering through the heavy curtains. The room smelled of furniture polish and something else, a faint staleness that suggested Lady Ashford rarely opened these particular windows. The furniture sat in careful arrangement, as if positioned for a photograph rather than actual use. Everything was precisely as such rooms always were, correct, pleasant, and entirely devoid of genuine life. From somewhere deeper within the house came the sound of voices, raised, though not loud enough for individual words to penetrate. Miss Marple moved toward the interior doorway with a shuffling gait that her acute rheumatism had made her trademark. The hall beyond was lined with family portraits, each face regarding her with the fixed expressions of people long dead, their eyes following her passage with the peculiar intensity of painted gazes. How many secrets, she wondered, had those walls absorbed over the decades? The library door stood slightly ajar, and the voices grew marginally clearer as Miss Marple approached. She was not by nature an eavesdropper. Indeed, she would have been rather shocked at any suggestion that her hearing was particularly acute. Yet somehow, she always seemed to be present at precisely those moments when truth inadvertently revealed itself to those willing to listen. "This is madness," Lady Ashford's voice, sharpened by an emotion Miss Marple couldn't quite name from her position in the hallway. Fear, perhaps, or anger, possibly both. "You cannot expect me to simply accept." "I expect nothing," the stranger's voice, deep and measured, with an accent that suggested his education had been refined, but his origins perhaps less so. "I am merely presenting the facts as they exist. Whether you accept them or not is entirely your concern." "The facts?" Caroline's mother's voice had risen another octave. "The facts are that you appear uninvited to my home and make the most extraordinary claims, and I am supposed to believe what you wish, Lady Ashford. But your daughter knows the truth. Perhaps you should ask her directly." Silence followed, the heavy, absolute silence of a moment when understanding begins to crystallize. Miss Marple heard the soft creak of a floorboard, the rustle of fabric, breathing slightly elevated from emotional exertion. She was withdrawing toward the morning room when the library door suddenly swung inward, and there stood Caroline Ashford, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with something that might have been panic or might have been resignation. For perhaps 2 seconds, the girl and the elderly woman regarded one another across the dimly lit hallway. Miss Marple saw, in that brief moment, the entire architecture of Caroline's crisis. The secret she'd been carrying, the desperate hope she'd harbored, the terrible realization of what had just transpired. And more than this, Miss Marple saw something in Caroline's expression that suggested the girl had been expecting to be discovered, as if she'd been counting down to this moment for weeks or months. "Miss Marple?" Caroline said softly, and her voice held the peculiar calm of someone who has finally surrendered to the inevitable. "I didn't know you'd come inside." "My dear," Miss Marple replied with gentle honesty, "I suspect there are quite a number of things you didn't know. Or perhaps things you chose not to know, which amounts to much the same thing." Behind Caroline, in the library's shadows, the stranger had risen from a chair, and behind him, her face a mask of confusion and dawning comprehension, stood Lady Ashford herself, one hand pressed to her throat in a gesture of shock. The three of them formed a tableau vivant, a frozen moment suspended between the world of comfortable ignorance and the harsh landscape of revealed truth. It was at this precise instant that the telephone began to ring, its shrill cry echoing through the manor's corridors with the insistence of an omen. The telephone's insistent ringing seemed to fracture the tension that had crystallized in the library doorway. Caroline glanced back toward the sound, her expression flickering with something that might have been relief or might have been dread. Lady Ashford's hand fell from her throat, and she moved with automatic obedience toward the telephone, as if answering it might somehow restore order to a world that had begun to tilt on its axis. The stranger remained motionless, his eyes tracking Lady Ashford's departure with the detached interest of someone observing a chess piece move across a board. Miss Marple heard Lady Ashford's distant greeting, the polite formality of her tone suggesting she had no idea who was calling. Then a pause, longer than was natural, followed by a sharp intake of breath and a whisper that nonetheless carried through the manor's corridors with the clarity of shock transmuting sound. "What? No, I don't understand. Are you quite certain? But that's impossible. She was only—" Another pause. Yes, I see. The constable, of course. We shall await their arrival." The telephone receiver was replaced, and for a moment there was only silence. Then Lady Ashford reappeared in the library doorway, her face having undergone a profound transformation. The confusion and dawning comprehension had been replaced by something far more primal, a kind of ashen disbelief that rendered her features almost unrecognizable. "That was the constable," she said slowly, as if the words themselves required considerable effort to articulate. "There has been an accident at Millbrook Cottage. Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax has been found dead." The name seemed to hang in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of consequence through the assembled company. Caroline made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, and she gripped the doorframe for support. The stranger's composure fractured for perhaps half a second, a tightening around his eyes, a minute adjustment in his breathing, before reasserting itself with visible effort. Miss Marple, observing all of this with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades watching human nature reveal itself through gesture and inflection, found herself reassessing the architecture of the afternoon's events. Eleanor Fairfax. The name was familiar in the way that names become familiar in small villages, not necessarily through personal acquaintance, but through the accumulated gossip and social observation that constituted the village's collective knowledge. Eleanor Fairfax had been, if Miss Marple's memory served correctly, a woman of perhaps 60 years, recently returned to Little Ashford after a lengthy absence. She had been living in some degree of seclusion at Millbrook Cottage, a modest property situated at the village's northern edge. "What sort of accident?" the stranger asked, his voice perfectly level, perfectly composed. Too perfectly composed, perhaps? The sort of composure that suggested considerable practice in maintaining emotional distance from matters that should have provoked surprise or concern. "They were unclear on the telephone," Lady Ashford replied, her own voice recovering some of its customary authority as shock began to yield to the reassertion of social habit. "Something about a fall," they said. "She was found at the bottom of the stairs in her cottage. The milkman discovered her when she didn't collect her morning delivery." Miss Marple noted the tense, past tense discovered, suggesting the incident had occurred sometime during the previous evening or early morning rather than recently. She also noted with considerable interest that Caroline had gone very still indeed. The girl's hand remained gripping the door frame, but her body had assumed the rigidity of someone deliberately restraining themselves from movement, as if any action might betray something she was desperately attempting to conceal. "How dreadful," Miss Marple said softly, the comment reaching across the loaded silence with the gentle inevitability of water finding its lowest point. "A fall, you say?" Eleanor Fairfax was a careful woman, from what I understand. Not the sort to be careless on staircases. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her simultaneously. Lady Ashford's expression suggested a vague confusion at Miss Marple's presence, as if she'd only just remembered the elderly woman standing in her hallway. The stranger's gaze held something more analytical, as if he were reassessing some calculation he'd already completed. And Caroline, poor Caroline, looked at Miss Marple with the desperate hope of someone who believes they've spotted a life raft in increasingly deep waters. "You knew Mrs. Fairfax?" Lady Ashford asked, clearly grasping at the conversational thread as a means of processing information too chaotic to otherwise comprehend. "Slightly," Miss Marple replied. "We shared acquaintances in the village, you understand. The usual connections that develop in small communities. Though I confess, I found her somewhat withdrawn since her return, rather as if she were waiting for something, or perhaps avoiding something. One can never quite tell, can one? The human face is remarkably skilled at concealing what the human heart most desperately wishes to hide." The constable would arrive within the hour, Miss Marple reflected, and then the peaceful narrative of the afternoon would be officially rewritten. What had seemed like an awkward family confrontation would become tangled with the complications of unexpected death. And the stranger, this carefully composed man who had delivered whatever extraordinary revelation he'd come to deliver, would find his plans significantly complicated by the inconvenient demise of Eleanor Fairfax. Miss Marple moved quietly back toward the garden, her mind already arranging the pieces of what she suspected might be the most complicated puzzle little Ashford had encountered in many years. The garden party had begun to dissolve into a state of controlled chaos by the time Miss Marple returned to the lawn. Word of Eleanor Fairfax's death had spread through the assembled guests with the speed of wildfire, transforming pleasant afternoon conversations into urgent clusters of speculation and shocked exclamation. The Women's Institute members had abandoned their refreshment table entirely, their heads bent together in that particular configuration that suggested they were simultaneously processing tragedy and composing narratives to explain it. The retired gentleman by the hedges had assumed the grave expressions of men confronted with matters beyond their immediate comprehension, though Miss Marple noted that more than one of them kept glancing toward the house, as if expecting some official pronouncement to clarify the situation. Constable William Marsh arrived at Thornfield Manor approximately 40 minutes after Lady Ashford's telephone call, his bicycle conveying him with the determined efficiency of a man accustomed to responding to the village's various emergencies. He was a competent officer in his early 50s, with the pragmatic temperament of someone who had learned that most crises resolve themselves more through patience and common sense than through dramatic intervention. He nodded politely to the assembled guests, exchanged a few words with Lady Ashford, and then made his way toward Millbrook Cottage, leaving the garden party to its increasingly frantic deliberations. Miss Marple observed that the stranger had vanished at some point during the confusion, slipped away with the sort of discretion that suggested considerable practice in unobserved departures. Caroline remained near the house, speaking to no one, her gaze fixed on some distant point that seemed to exist somewhere beyond the immediate garden. Lady Ashford had assumed the role of hostess managing crisis, suggesting that guests might wish to depart given the tragic circumstances, yet simultaneously invoking the social convention that suggested remaining would be the only proper response to collective tragedy. It was a delicate balance, and one that Lady Ashford managed with the authority of someone accustomed to navigating the unwritten rules that governed village society. By late afternoon, Constable Marsh had returned, and with him came Inspector Edmund Thornton of the County Constabulary, a man of Miss Marple's approximate age, with silver hair and the weary expression of someone who had spent decades investigating crimes that small villages insisted on committing despite their outward appearance of peaceful respectability. Miss Marple had encountered Inspector Thornton on several previous occasions, and they had developed the sort of professional regard that develops between people who approach problems from fundamentally different methodologies, yet occasionally arrive at similar conclusions. The inspector's first action was to request that the garden party be concluded, that guests depart, and that no one in the immediate vicinity of Thornfield Manor discuss the matter publicly until preliminary inquiries had been completed. It was a request phrased with considerable politeness, yet carrying the underlying weight of official authority. The assembled guests complied with remarkable alacrity, as if relieved to be released from the social obligation to maintain pleasant conversation while absorbing news of unexpected death. By the time the last guest had departed and the sun had begun its descent toward the western hills, Miss Marple found herself standing near the stone balustrade where she had begun her afternoon, observing the manor house with renewed attention. The east wing windows, which had reflected sunlight so brilliantly during the party, now gazed back with the blank opacity of closing evening. Somewhere within that vast structure, Lady Ashford was presumably speaking with Inspector Thornton regarding the mysterious stranger, and whatever revelation he had delivered before Eleanor Fairfax's death had reoriented everyone's attention. "I thought I might find you here," a familiar voice observed from behind her. Inspector Thornton approached with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that hurried movements often disturbed witnesses and suspects alike. "You were present at the party this afternoon, Miss Marple. I wonder if you might have observed something that others perhaps missed." Miss Marple turned to regard the inspector with the gentle expression that had become her trademark. "I observed many things, Inspector. The question, as always, is whether any of them possess significance or whether they are merely the accumulated minutiae that constitute any social gathering. Perhaps you might share your observations, and we can determine significance together," Inspector Thornton replied, settling himself beside her with a sigh that suggested a long day had become considerably longer. "Eleanor Fairfax," Miss Marple began carefully, "was a woman who had lived quite apart from the village during her recent residence here. Few people knew her well. Yet this afternoon, a gentleman arrived at the garden party whom I had not encountered previously. He spoke briefly with Mr. Thorpe, and then he departed toward the house. Approximately 3 minutes later, a young woman who is intimately connected to this household followed him inside, and Lady Ashford had also withdrawn to the interior of the manor. You're suggesting the three of them had planned to meet?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that when three people who would not naturally have reason for private conversation arrange to be in the same house simultaneously, and when one of them carries an expression suggesting they are about to receive information of considerable consequence, it is worth considering what conversations might have transpired, and I'm further suggesting that whatever those conversations involved, they are somehow connected to the fact that Eleanor Fairfax is now deceased." Inspector Thornton regarded her thoughtfully. "And what, in your estimation, would be the nature of such a connection?" Miss Marple gazed out toward the darkening garden, where shadows were beginning to obscure the carefully manicured borders and the precision-trimmed hedges. "That, Inspector, is precisely what we need to discover, though I suspect it will require understanding not what Eleanor Fairfax was, but rather who she had been." Inspector Thornton remained silent for a considerable time, his eyes scanning the darkening garden as if he might locate answers within the lengthening shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of frustration tempered by professional experience. Eleanor Fairfax's background is rather murky, I'm afraid. She arrived in Little Ashford approximately 4 months ago, rented Millbrook Cottage through a solicitor's arrangement, and kept largely to herself. The preliminary examination of her body suggests the fall was indeed the cause of death. Significant injuries consistent with tumbling down a wooden staircase. Yet there are certain peculiarities. Peculiarities, Miss Marple prompted gently. The constable noted that her cottage was exceptionally tidy. No signs of struggle, no indication of anything that might have caused her to lose her footing. The stairs themselves were dry and unobstructed, and perhaps most oddly, she was wearing evening dress, a rather elaborate gown, despite the fact that she lived in solitude and had made no social engagements. The milkman found her at 7:30 this morning, but the state of rigor mortis suggested she had likely died some 8 to 10 hours previously, roughly between 9 and 11 o'clock last evening. Miss Marple processed this information with the methodical care of someone examining a particularly complex piece of needlework. The timing was significant. Eleanor Fairfax had died while the garden party was still in progress, while guests were consuming refreshments and engaging in pleasant conversation mere miles away, while the stranger was conducting his mysterious conversation with Lady Ashford and Caroline. While the entire machinery of village society continued its uninterrupted operation, indifferent to the fact that someone was dying in a cottage at the village's periphery. "The gentleman who visited Thornfield Manor this afternoon," Miss Marple said carefully. "Have you identified him?" "Not yet. Lady Ashford claims he arrived uninvited and that she has no knowledge of his purpose or identity. However, her daughter, Miss Caroline Ashford, has proven somewhat more forthcoming. It appears the gentleman is named David Hartwell, and he claims to be a private investigator hired to conduct inquiries into certain matters affecting the Ashford family. He departed Thornfield Manor approximately an hour after his arrival, and the servants report seeing him leave in a motor car that was apparently arranged in advance. We're attempting to locate him now." The name struck something in Miss Marple's memory. Not directly, but obliquely, the way that a forgotten melody sometimes surfaces unbidden when one hears a particular chord progression. David Hartwell, a private investigator, someone hired to investigate matters affecting the Ashford family. It was the sort of designation that suggested secrets of considerable magnitude, the sort of secrets that required outside assistance to excavate. "And what," Miss Marple asked, "did Miss Caroline reveal regarding Mr. Hartwell's investigation?" Inspector Thornton shifted his weight, his expression suggesting he was carefully choosing his words. She was rather reticent on that point. She maintained that the matter was private family business and that Eleanor Fairfax's death was entirely unrelated to whatever business had brought Mr. Hartwell to the manor. However, I found her manner somewhat unconvincing. There was an element of performance to her responses, as if she had rehearsed certain phrases in preparation for questioning. "As if she were protecting someone," Miss Marple observed. "Precisely my impression. Though whether she is protecting Mr. Hartwell, her mother, or some other party remains to be determined." The sun had now descended below the horizon, leaving the garden bathed in the peculiar twilight that precedes full darkness. The temperature had begun to drop, and Miss Marple drew her cardigan more closely around her shoulders. She was thinking of Caroline's trembling hands, of the expression in the girl's eyes when she had encountered Miss Marple in the hallway. She was thinking of Eleanor Fairfax, dressed in evening gown despite her solitary residence, dying alone at the bottom of her cottage stairs, and she was thinking of the stranger, David Hartwell, with his careful composure and his analytical gaze, arriving to reveal secrets and then departing before the full consequences of those revelations could unfold. "There is one matter that troubles me, Inspector," Miss Marple said slowly. If Eleanor Fairfax died between 9 and 11 o'clock last evening, and if she was wearing formal dress, might it not be reasonable to assume she was expecting a visitor? Someone she was anticipating with sufficient formality to warrant changing into evening attire. Inspector Thornton's expression underwent a subtle shift, as if he were reassessing information he had already considered but had perhaps not fully explored. "You're suggesting she did not fall accidentally?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that before we accept any narrative regarding how Eleanor Fairfax came to her demise, we might profitably investigate why she believed she would require formal dress during an evening at home. And more particularly, we might investigate who among the residents of Little Ashford possessed knowledge that Eleanor Fairfax would be wearing that particular gown on that particular evening." The inspector rose from his position beside the balustrade, his movements suddenly purposeful. "I believe, Miss Marple, that I should conduct a more thorough interview with Miss Caroline Ashford. Your observations have suggested certain avenues of inquiry that I had, perhaps, not sufficiently explored." As he departed toward the manor, Miss Marple remained at the balustrade, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in Little Ashford, someone had stood before Eleanor Fairfax at the moment she lost her footing on those fateful stairs. Someone who had known she would be dressed for a visitor. Someone whose presence in that cottage had precipitated the series of events that had culminated in death. And Miss Marple suspected she already knew precisely who that someone was. Caroline Ashford's interview with Inspector Thornton occurred in the morning room of Thornfield Manor, conducted with the formal protocol that transformed even familiar domestic spaces into interrogation chambers. Miss Marple was not present for this exchange, yet she gathered its essential details through the village's remarkably efficient system of information distribution: the gardener's boy who had overheard fragments of conversation, the parlour maid who had observed the inspector's expression when departing the interview, the subtle shifts in demeanour that suggested revelations had occurred. What emerged, pieced together from these fragmentary sources, was a narrative considerably more complex than the straightforward domestic crisis that the afternoon had initially suggested. Eleanor Fairfax, it transpired, was not merely a woman of mysterious background who had chosen to live in seclusion. She was, in fact, the former governess to the Ashford household, employed by Lord and Lady Ashford some 20 years prior, before Caroline had been born. She had departed under circumstances that the village records had deemed sufficiently delicate to obscure, the official explanation being that family circumstances required her to seek employment elsewhere. However, David Hartwell's investigation had uncovered considerably more detailed information. Eleanor Fairfax had departed Thornfield Manor because she had been with child. The father, according to Hartwell's discoveries, had been the late Lord Ashford himself. The child, a daughter, had been placed with a family in the Midlands for adoption, and Eleanor had been provided with sufficient financial settlement to ensure her silence and her permanent departure from the region. Yet Eleanor Fairfax had returned to Little Ashford 4 months ago, and David Hartwell had been hired, by whom Caroline initially refused to divulge, though Inspector Thornton's persistent questioning eventually elicited the name, by the Ashford family's solicitor, acting on instructions from an anonymous correspondent. That correspondent had made inquiries regarding the whereabouts of Eleanor Fairfax and had indicated that matters of considerable financial and familial consequence would depend upon locating her before certain information became public knowledge. It was this revelation that had prompted Caroline's trembling hands during the garden party. The girl had not yet been informed of her father's indiscretion, and David Hartwell's appearance at Thornfield Manor was intended to deliver this news to Lady Ashford in advance of Eleanor's own potential revelations. What no one had anticipated was that Eleanor Fairfax would be dead before the afternoon had concluded. Inspector Thornton, operating from these newly acquired details, redirected his investigation with considerably more focus. He interviewed the servants of Thornfield Manor, inquiring whether any of them had observed unusual activities the previous evening. He examined the household accounts to determine whether any funds had been transferred that might suggest payment for services rendered. And most significantly, he requested that Caroline provide a detailed account of her movements during the hours between 9 and 11 o'clock the previous evening. Caroline's response was, predictably, evasive. She had been in her room, she maintained, occupied with personal correspondence and preparation for the garden party. She had seen neither her mother nor any other household member during that interval. She had heard nothing unusual. She could not account for her exact whereabouts with the precision that Inspector Thornton's questioning demanded. It was during this impasse that Miss Marple, who had retired to the Thornfield drawing-room to observe the proceedings with the appearance of gentle disinterest, finally intervened. She requested a private word with the inspector, and when they had withdrawn to a quiet corner of the manor, she proceeded to articulate an observation that altered the trajectory of the entire investigation. "Miss Caroline is protecting someone," Miss Marple began, "but not, I think, for reasons of personal loyalty. Rather, I suspect she is protecting someone out of fear of consequences, fear of scandal, or perhaps fear of discovering information that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her own family. However, there is someone else in this household who has been exhibiting rather more telling signs of culpability." "And who might that be?" Inspector Thornton asked, though his expression suggested he suspected he would not like the answer. "Lady Ashford herself," Miss Marple replied gently. "Consider the sequence of events, Inspector. David Hartwell was hired to deliver information regarding Eleanor Fairfax's return. Lady Ashford learned that her husband had fathered a child with the governess 2 decades prior. Eleanor Fairfax, living in seclusion at Millbrook Cottage, was presumably preparing to make demands, financial, emotional, or otherwise, regarding her situation. Lady Ashford, confronted with the dissolution of comfortable illusions regarding her marriage, faced a situation of considerable anguish. And Eleanor Fairfax, who had returned to the village after years of absence, would have been particularly vulnerable to intervention. Inspector Thornton's jaw tightened visibly. "You're suggesting that Lady Ashford deliberately caused Eleanor's death?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple corrected carefully, "that we examine the evidence with particular attention to Lady Ashford's movements and state of mind during the critical interval. I would note that during the garden party, Lady Ashford announced she was retiring for rest, yet she appeared in the library sometime thereafter. I would note that she had access to knowledge that Eleanor would be expecting a visitor, information that could only have come from David Hartwell's inquiries. And I would note that a woman of Lady Ashford's social standing and household management experience would possess considerable knowledge regarding how to arrange a meeting at a remote cottage, and how to ensure that such a meeting would be unobserved by village gossips." The inspector remained silent, his expression reflecting the internal struggle of a man confronted with evidence that contradicted his initial assumptions. If Lady Ashford did meet with Eleanor Fairfax, that does not necessarily indicate she was responsible for her death. The fall could have been genuine, an accident that occurred during a confrontation between 2 women, one of whom was emotionally distressed. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "which is precisely why we must now determine whether Lady Ashford can account for her precise whereabouts during the critical hours, and whether she possesses any injuries or evidence upon her person that might suggest she was present at Millbrook Cottage when Eleanor Fairfax fell." Inspector Thornton's subsequent interview with Lady Ashford proceeded with considerably more formality than his earlier conversation with Caroline. The drawing-room, which had seemed a pleasant space during the afternoon's garden party, now took on the character of an interrogation chamber, its comfortable furnishings and carefully arranged flowers unable to mitigate the underlying tension. Lady Ashford appeared diminished somehow, not physically, but in the way that people diminish when confronted with the collapse of carefully maintained structures that have supported their social existence. "I did not visit Eleanor Fairfax," Lady Ashford stated, her voice pitched with the particular quality of someone reciting a truth that nonetheless carried the weight of desperation. "I had no reason to visit her. Whatever arrangement Mr. Hartwell made regarding his inquiries was conducted through proper channels. I was not involved in contacting Eleanor or arranging any meeting. Yet you were aware of her return to Little Ashford, Inspector Thornton observed, consulting his notes with deliberate slowness. Mr. Hartwell informed you of her whereabouts this afternoon. You knew that she had been residing at Millbrook Cottage for the past 4 months. And you were aware that she possessed information of considerable consequence regarding your marriage and your family's reputation. Awareness is not culpability, Inspector, Lady Ashford replied, but her hands twisted together in her lap, betraying the composure her voice attempted to maintain. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the window, noted the precise moment when Lady Ashford's composure began to fracture. Not dramatically, but in the subtle way that human beings falter when confronted with the gap between the story they have constructed and the reality that others have discerned. The older woman shifted her weight, her eyes moving away from the inspector's gaze, and her hand moved momentarily to her throat. That same gesture she had made when the telephone call had first conveyed news of Eleanor's death. "Lady Ashford," Miss Marple interjected gently, drawing the inspector's attention and, more importantly, redirecting Lady Ashford's focus. "I wonder if you might tell us about your dress, the gown you wore to the garden party this afternoon. It was cream-colored, with pearl embroidery, was it not? Quite lovely, though I couldn't help noticing that there appeared to be several small stains near the hem. Dirt, perhaps? Or something else?" Lady Ashford's hand moved instinctively toward her skirt, then stopped as she recognized the trap inherent in the gesture. "I was walking in the garden this morning," she said carefully, "before the party. The grounds can be quite muddy in places. The grounds at Thornfield Manor are invariably well maintained," Miss Marple observed with gentle precision. "However, the lane leading toward Millbrook Cottage is considerably less tidy, particularly in the vicinity of the cottage itself, where the gravel has been worn away in places, exposing the underlying clay. Rather difficult to avoid soiling one's hem when visiting such locations. Wouldn't you agree?" Inspector Thornton turned toward Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he was simultaneously grateful for her intervention and frustrated by his own oversight. "Lady Ashford, I must insist that you provide a complete accounting of your movements during the evening hours yesterday, and I must request that we examine the dress in question and conduct a preliminary assessment regarding the nature and origin of those stains." What followed was a silence of considerable duration, during which Lady Ashford appeared to undergo an internal struggle of significant magnitude. Her hands, which had been twisting together, gradually stilled. Her shoulders, which had been held rigid in an attempt to maintain composure, relaxed incrementally, and her eyes, which had been avoiding direct contact, finally fixed themselves upon the inspector with an expression that suggested capitulation. "I did visit Eleanor," she said quietly, "but not to harm her. I went to offer her money, a considerable sum sufficient to ensure her silence and her departure from Little Ashford. I believed that she had returned with the intention of extorting funds or creating scandal. I thought that if I offered her an adequate settlement, she would simply disappear as she had done before." "What time did you arrive at Millbrook Cottage?" Inspector Thornton asked, his tone suggesting that confirmation of this detail was tantamount to admission of guilt. "Approximately 9 o'clock. I had arranged the meeting through a message left at the cottage that afternoon. Eleanor was expecting me." "And what occurred during your meeting?" Lady Ashford's voice, when she spoke again, carried the hollow quality of someone recounting events that seemed to have occurred to another person entirely. She was dressed formally, as if preparing for a social engagement. She seemed different than I had remembered her. Harder, perhaps, or perhaps simply older. She had been living in isolation for so long that her manner had become peculiar. When I offered her the settlement, she refused. She said she had not returned to Little Ashford for financial compensation. She said she had returned because she had discovered that her daughter, the child that had been placed for adoption, had made inquiries regarding her family history. She said she intended to facilitate a reunion, regardless of the consequences for our family reputation. The inspector exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, and Miss Marple could perceive the precise moment when his understanding underwent recalibration. This was not a narrative of deliberate crime, but rather something far more complicated. A collision between competing desires, between the human need to maintain social position and the equally human need to resolve the wounds of past betrayals. "And what happened next, Lady Ashford?" the inspector pressed. We argued. I attempted to convince her that such a reunion would create considerable pain, not only for myself and my family, but for her daughter as well. Eleanor became increasingly agitated. She began pacing toward the stairs, speaking of her rights as a mother, of the injustice of her situation. She was so focused on her own narrative that she did not watch her footing. She simply fell. I saw her reach for the banister, but she was too unbalanced. She fell, and I stood there, paralyzed, watching her descend the stairs. The confession, once it had been articulated, seemed to empty something from Lady Ashford. Not her dignity, precisely, but rather the carefully maintained fiction that had sustained her through the preceding hours. She sank back into her chair with the exhaustion of someone who had been holding herself upright through sheer force of will and had finally surrendered to the weight of accumulated events. Inspector Thornton rose and moved toward the window, his expression reflecting the complexity of what he had just heard. The narrative Lady Ashford had provided was internally consistent, emotionally coherent, and yet it raised as many questions as it answered. An accident, she had maintained. A tragic confluence of emotional distress and careless movement. Yet she had remained silent, had allowed the initial investigation to proceed without disclosure, had permitted suspicion to drift toward others, particularly toward her own daughter. "You did not seek assistance," Inspector Thornton observed, his tone neither accusatory nor sympathetic, simply stating fact. "Eleanor Fairfax lay injured at the bottom of the stairs, and you departed the cottage without summoning medical aid." "She was already dead," Lady Ashford said quietly. "I checked. She was not breathing. Her body was at an angle that suggested the injuries were too severe for survival. I stood there for, I don't know how long. Minutes, certainly. I considered calling for help, but I realized that if I did, everything would emerge. Everything about Eleanor's past, about my husband's indiscretion, about the child that had been placed for adoption. And I thought, I am ashamed to admit what I thought, but I thought that if Eleanor remained undiscovered for a time, perhaps the story would be different. Perhaps it would be treated as a domestic accident rather than as a murder, which is what it would surely be perceived as if I were present when she fell. Miss Marple, observing this exchange from her position beside the window, found herself thinking of the intricate web of human motivation that connected all the parties in this tragic narrative. Eleanor Fairfax had returned to Little Ashford carrying her own hidden agenda, her own desperate hope of reconnection with the daughter she had been forced to relinquish. Caroline had been struggling with the knowledge of her father's betrayal, a knowledge that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her own family history. And Lady Ashford had been confronted with the dissolution of illusions that had sustained her for 2 decades, the comfortable belief that the past had been successfully sealed away, that old wounds could remain unexamined indefinitely. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "I wonder if you might permit me to ask Lady Ashford a question of some delicacy." Inspector Thornton, after a moment's consideration, nodded his assent. Miss Marple turned her attention to Lady Ashford with the particular gentleness that she reserved for moments requiring considerable emotional sensitivity. "Eleanor Fairfax," Miss Marple began carefully, "had been residing in isolation at Millbrook Cottage for 4 months. Yet she was dressed formally on the evening of her death. Dressed, I would suggest, not because she was expecting you, but because she was expecting someone else. Someone she believed might be her daughter, perhaps, or someone connected to her daughter's inquiries. Lady Ashford's expression underwent a subtle shift, and she looked toward Miss Marple with an intensity that suggested the question had struck at something fundamental. I do not know. When I arrived at the cottage, Eleanor mentioned that she was expecting another visitor. A young woman, she said. Someone from London who had responded to her inquiries. She said she had received a letter indicating that her daughter had made initial contact through a family research organization. She was hoping this evening visitor might provide confirmation. Inspector Thornton's attention sharpened considerably. Did Eleanor provide a name for this anticipated visitor? No. She said the matter was still uncertain, that she did not wish to discuss it until she had met with the woman in person. She indicated that she would be receiving this visitor after I departed. The implications of this revelation rippled through the drawing room like concentric circles expanding across still water. If Eleanor had been expecting a visitor, a young woman from London who claimed to be inquiring about family history, then the timeline of events required reconsideration. Eleanor could not have died from an accident occasioned by her argument with Lady Ashford if she had subsequently received another visitor. Lady Ashford, Inspector Thornton asked with renewed urgency, what precisely was the time when you discovered Eleanor at the bottom of the stairs? Approximately 9 o'clock, Lady Ashford replied. I consulted my watch to determine the hour, thinking I must hurry back to Thornfield Manor before my absence from the garden party became conspicuous. And Eleanor was definitely deceased at that moment. Absolutely. Her body was quite still. There was no breath, no pulse when I checked her wrist. She had struck her head against the wooden newel post at the base of the stairs. The injury was catastrophic. Inspector Thornton exchanged a prolonged glance with Miss Marple, and she could perceive the precise moment when his understanding underwent fundamental recalibration. If Eleanor Fairfax had indeed been dead at 9 o'clock, then the preliminary medical examination that had suggested she died between 9 and 11 o'clock was only partially accurate. She might have died significantly earlier. The evening dress, the anticipation of a visitor from London, these details suggested a narrative considerably more complex than Lady Ashford's account implied. Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly, I believe we must reconsider the fundamental premise of our investigation. The question is not how Eleanor Fairfax fell down the stairs, but rather whether her fall was the actual cause of her death at all. The implication of Miss Marple's statement hung suspended in the drawing room like a subtle poison dispersing through otherwise clear air. Inspector Thornton's expression shifted through several configurations: confusion, resistance, and finally a grim acknowledgement of the logical consequences inherent in her observation. He moved toward the telephone with the deliberate purpose of a man confronted with the necessity of reconsidering evidence he had already evaluated. Within the hour, the preliminary medical examination of Eleanor Fairfax's body had been subjected to considerably more rigorous scrutiny. The physician who had initially certified the cause of death as injuries sustained from a fall was summoned back to Millbrook Cottage, where he conducted a more thorough investigation with the assistance of a pathologist dispatched from the county. What they discovered beneath Eleanor's carefully arranged evening dress contradicted the narrative that had initially seemed so plausible. Eleanor Fairfax had sustained two distinct categories of injury. The first, the visible trauma to her head and the fractures consistent with a fall down wooden stairs, was genuine. However, the second category of injury was far more revealing. Evidence of a deliberate blow to the base of her skull, administered before her contact with the stairs. The weapon appeared to have been something heavy and blunt, possibly a decorative object from the cottage itself. And the injury, according to the pathologist's preliminary assessment, would have rendered Eleanor either unconscious or severely disoriented. The subsequent fall down the stairs would have been incidental to the primary cause of death. Deliberate violence, Inspector Thornton said quietly, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who has allowed himself to be misdirected by convenient narrative. We have not been investigating an accident or even a crime of passion. We have been investigating a premeditated attack designed to appear accidental. Which explains, Miss Marple added, her tone remaining carefully measured. Why someone would go to considerable effort to ensure that Eleanor appeared to be a woman accustomed to formal entertaining. The evening dress was not intended to seem peculiar. It was intended to establish a narrative of Eleanor preparing for social engagement, of a tragic misstep occurring during emotional conversation. Someone wished Eleanor's death to appear as accidental as possible. Lady Ashford, who had been observing these developments with increasing comprehension, made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Then my arrival at the cottage did not. She could not complete the sentence, but her meaning was clear. The responsibility for Eleanor's death could not be laid at the feet of her own argument and Eleanor's careless movement. Eleanor had already been dying or dead when Lady Ashford arrived. "When you found Eleanor at the bottom of the stairs," Inspector Thornton asked with renewed intensity, "was there any indication that someone else had been present? Any sign of recent departure? Anything that suggested another person had been in the cottage immediately before your arrival?" Lady Ashford's eyes moved upward as she attempted to recall details that shock had obscured. "The front door was unlocked when I arrived. I assumed Eleanor had left it unlocked specifically to admit me. But now that I consider it, the parlor door was ajar. Eleanor's handbag lay on the floor near the sitting room. I initially thought she had simply been careless, but—" She paused, her expression shifting as understanding crystallized. Someone had searched through her belongings. Papers were scattered across the table. Letters had been removed from envelopes. Inspector Thornton's jaw tightened visibly. Eleanor had received correspondence regarding her daughter's inquiries. Someone knew about this correspondence. Someone believed that Eleanor possessed information, letters perhaps, or contact details, that they wished to prevent from being discovered. Miss Marple moved toward a small side table, where she examined the room's furnishings with deliberate attention. The question becomes not who Eleanor was expecting to visit, but rather who visited her before Lady Ashford's arrival, who possessed knowledge of Eleanor's circumstances, who understood the significance of her reunion with her daughter, and who possessed motivation to prevent that reunion from occurring. "David Hartwell," Lady Ashford said suddenly, her voice carrying the intensity of painful recognition. "The investigator, he was hired to locate Eleanor, to determine whether she might make claims against the family. He would have known exactly where she was living, what she had been planning. He would have understood the threat she represented to family interests." Inspector Thornton was already moving toward the telephone to issue new instructions, yet Miss Marple raised a hand in gentle restraint. "Before we pursue that particular avenue, Inspector, I wonder if we might consider a more troubling possibility. Mr. Hartwell was hired by someone connected to the Ashford family, acting through the family's solicitor. Someone who understood that Eleanor's return to Little Ashford constituted a threat. Someone who possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to ensure that Eleanor's reunion with her daughter never occurred." "You're suggesting," Inspector Thornton said slowly, "that someone within the Ashford household itself arranged Eleanor's death." "I'm suggesting that we must examine who benefited most from Eleanor's death remaining undiscovered. Who had the most to lose if Eleanor succeeded in establishing contact with her daughter, and who possessed sufficient desperation to take extreme action to prevent such contact." Caroline Ashford, who had been standing silently in the doorway throughout this exchange, made a sudden movement as if to flee. Inspector Thornton's raised hand halted her departure. "Miss Ashford, I believe we have considerably more to discuss regarding your movements yesterday evening and your knowledge of your father's past." As Caroline was led away for formal questioning, Miss Marple gazed toward the window where the evening light was beginning to fade. The pieces of this tragedy were gradually assembling themselves into a coherent pattern, a pattern that would require one final revelation before the complete truth could be articulated. And Miss Marple suspected she understood precisely what that revelation would be. Caroline Ashford's interrogation proceeded with considerably more urgency than her earlier interview. Yet it was marked by a peculiar hesitation on the part of the young woman. She answered questions with apparent honesty, provided details regarding her movements and her state of knowledge, yet there remained something fundamentally evasive in her manner, as if she were speaking truth about peripheral matters while maintaining silence regarding something of greater consequence. I knew nothing of Eleanor Fairfax until Mr. Hartwell arrived at Thornfield Manor this afternoon, Caroline stated with apparent candor. I was informed during our private conversation that my father had fathered a child with the governess. It was shocking information. I required time to process it, but I did not visit Millbrook Cottage. I did not see Eleanor Fairfax, and I certainly did not harm her. Your movements yesterday evening remain unaccounted for, Inspector Thornton observed, consulting his notes with deliberate precision. The servants report seeing you retire to your room at approximately 8 o'clock. Yet no one observed you during the critical interval between 9 and 11 o'clock. You could have easily departed the manor without observation, travelled to Millbrook Cottage and returned. But I did not, Caroline insisted, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. I remained in my room throughout the evening. I was reading. I heard nothing unusual. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself beside the inspector with an air of quiet observation, noticed something that others appeared to have overlooked. Caroline's eyes, when she denied visiting the cottage, maintained direct contact with the inspector. Her breathing remained steady. Her voice carried the cadence of truthfulness. Yet her left hand, which rested upon the table between them, bore a thin scratch along the inner wrist, the sort of injury that might result from contact with rough fabric or perhaps from defensive movement during a physical struggle. "Miss Ashford," Miss Marple said gently, drawing the young woman's startled attention, "that injury to your wrist is quite recent. Within the past 24 hours, I would estimate. How did you acquire it?" Caroline's hand instinctively moved to conceal the scratch, and her composure fractured visibly. It was nothing. A gardening accident. I was pruning roses this morning and caught myself on a thorn. The roses at Thornfield Manor are most carefully maintained, Miss Marple observed with gentle persistence. I examined them during the garden party, and they bear no thorns of sufficient sharpness to inflict such a wound. However, the wild roses that grow near the lane leading to Millbrook Cottage are considerably more formidable. One would require considerable force to sustain such a wound in their presence. Force, perhaps, that might accompany physical struggle or defensive movement. The silence that followed Caroline's failed deception was profound and absolute. The young woman's face underwent a transformation from attempted composure to something far more complex, a mixture of fear, resignation, and something that might have been relief at finally being compelled toward honesty. "I did not kill her," Caroline said quietly, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone confessing to a crime she did not commit, yet accepting responsibility nonetheless. "But I was there. I arrived at Millbrook Cottage at approximately 8:30 o'clock. Eleanor had written to me, a letter that somehow bypassed the manor's normal correspondence procedures and was delivered directly to me through the village postman. She identified herself as the former governess and indicated that she possessed information regarding my family that she believed I should know directly." "What information?" Inspector Thornton demanded. "She told me that I had a sister, a half-sister, the product of my father's affair with her. She said that this sister had been placed for adoption as an infant, but that she, Eleanor, had recently been contacted by the daughter seeking information about her biological parents. Eleanor said she believed I had a right to know this before the situation became public knowledge through other means." Caroline's hands, which had been trembling, gradually stilled as she continued her narrative. "I was shocked, naturally, disturbed, but Eleanor seemed genuine in her concern. She offered me tea. We sat in her parlor and discussed the situation, and then she said something that changed everything. She said that if I truly cared about my half-sister, I should help her locate my father's will and any documents that might indicate financial provision for her. She suggested that my father, despite his indiscretion, might have made arrangements for his illegitimate daughter's security. "And you consented to assist her in this matter?" Miss Marple asked. "I began to suspect that Eleanor's intentions were not entirely altruistic," Caroline continued. "I suggested that we should contact Mr. Hartwell, the investigator, and allow him to pursue such matters through proper channels." Eleanor became increasingly agitated. She insisted that I understood nothing of her situation, that she had sacrificed everything for propriety and expectation, that she deserved recompense for the decades she had spent in exile from her own child. She became uncontrolled. She began pacing frantically, speaking of injustices and betrayals, and then she said something that I found deeply disturbing. "What did she say?" Inspector Thornton pressed. "She said that if my father would not provide for her daughter willingly, then she would ensure that the Ashford family paid through scandal and public revelation. She said she would contact my father's business associates, his social circle, everyone of consequence in his life. She said she would make certain that he was remembered not as a respected businessman, but as a man who had abandoned his own child." Caroline's voice had become barely audible. I realized at that moment that Eleanor had returned to Little Ashford not out of desire for reconciliation with her daughter, but out of desire for revenge. Revenge against my father, against my mother, against everyone connected to the family that had deemed her situation shameful enough to conceal through adoption and financial settlement. And I understood that her threat was entirely credible. She possessed knowledge and determination sufficient to destroy everything my family had spent decades constructing. Miss Marple and Inspector Thornton exchanged a glance that suggested they both perceived the trajectory toward which this confession was moving. Yet neither of them spoke, allowing Caroline to continue with the terrible momentum of truth finally breaking free from carefully maintained concealment. When she turned toward the stairs to fetch documents she claimed would support her position, I pushed her. I did not intend for her to fall. I was simply trying to stop her from taking action I knew would devastate my family, but she was already agitated, already moving with careless force. She lost her footing almost immediately. Caroline's confession dissolved into silence, broken only by her quiet weeping. The narrative she had articulated was not, strictly speaking, a complete contradiction of the medical evidence, yet it required certain amplifications to align with the pathologist's findings. Inspector Thornton rose from his seat and moved toward the window, his expression reflecting the particular weariness of a man who had pursued truth only to discover that truth itself was more complex than any simple narrative could contain. "Miss Ashford?" he said quietly. "The medical examination indicates that Eleanor Fairfax sustained a deliberate blow to the base of her skull before she fell down the stairs. Your account does not align with such evidence. A push, however forceful, would not produce such an injury. Someone struck Eleanor with a heavy object. Someone whose actions were deliberate and calculated." Caroline's face, which had been marked by the relief of partial confession, underwent another transformation. Her eyes widened with genuine shock and confusion. No, I did not strike her. I simply pushed her away from me when she became too agitated. She fell. I watched her fall. I could not have—" "Yet you remained silent," Inspector Thornton continued, his tone neither accusing nor sympathetic, merely factual. "You allowed your mother to visit Eleanor without knowledge of what Eleanor had already suffered. You permitted the investigation to proceed without disclosure of your presence at the cottage. You accepted the possibility that your mother might be charged with murder when you possessed knowledge that would have altered the investigation's trajectory." It was at this moment that Miss Marple rose from her position and moved toward the door with the deliberate purpose of someone who had abruptly reached a critical realization. "Inspector, I believe we require the presence of one additional individual in this conversation. Someone who possessed knowledge of Eleanor's circumstances, who understood the threat she represented to the Ashford family's interests, and who possessed both the opportunity and the motivation to ensure that Eleanor's threats would never be articulated." "Whom do you suggest?" Inspector Thornton asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Mr. Gerald Thorpe, the family solicitor. Miss Marple replied. The man through whom David Hartwell was retained. The man who would have received correspondence regarding Eleanor's whereabouts and intentions. The man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, the legal and financial implications of Eleanor's return to Little Ashford and her determination to claim inheritance on behalf of her illegitimate daughter. Within the hour, Mr. Gerald Thorpe was brought to Thornfield Manor for questioning. He was a man of approximately 60 years with the carefully maintained appearance of someone who had built his professional reputation upon discretion and reliability. Yet his composure fractured almost immediately when confronted with the evidence that had accumulated regarding Eleanor's death. "I did not intend to harm her," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of desperation that accompanies the collapse of carefully maintained deceptions. "Eleanor contacted me directly, threatening to make public claims against the Ashford estate. She demanded financial compensation for the years she had spent in exile, and she insisted upon inheritance provisions for her daughter. I explained to her that such claims would require considerable legal maneuvering and would inevitably expose the family to scandal. I suggested that she might be more satisfied through private negotiation." "Yet Eleanor refused your suggested terms," Miss Marple observed gently. "She was entirely unreasonable," Thorpe continued, his voice becoming increasingly urgent. "She insisted upon contacting the family directly, upon forcing them to acknowledge their responsibility. She said she was tired of silence, tired of being treated as though her suffering was shameful, tired of accepting settlements designed merely to ensure her continued invisibility. She said she intended to visit Caroline at Thornfield Manor to inform the girl of the true circumstances of her birth." "And you could not permit that to occur," Miss Marple said softly. "I attempted to reason with her," Thorpe insisted. "I came to Millbrook Cottage to make one final appeal. I brought documents demonstrating the financial arrangements that had been made on her behalf, hoping to convince her that she had been adequately provided for. But Eleanor was adamant. She said she valued her dignity more than money. She said she was prepared to face scandal rather than continue living, as though her existence were an embarrassment to be concealed." Thorpe's hands trembled as he continued. "There was a decorative sculpture in her parlor, a bronze piece that appeared to be of considerable value. In my frustration, in my desperation to prevent her from taking action that would devastate the family I had represented for decades, I simply acted. I did not plan it. I did not contemplate the consequences. I struck her, and then I panicked. I attempted to arrange the scene to suggest an accidental fall, and then I departed, leaving Miss Caroline to discover Eleanor's body," Inspector Thornton said, his tone hardening. "Leaving a young woman to believe herself responsible for a crime she did not commit, allowing her to carry that burden through the subsequent investigation. I did not know that Caroline had visited the cottage," Thorpe said, his voice breaking. "I only learned of her presence when she confessed. By that time, I had already become committed to silence." The remaining hours of the investigation proceeded with the grim efficiency of bureaucratic machinery processing crimes that defied simple categorization. Caroline was released from immediate suspicion, though the question of her own culpability in the events leading to Eleanor's death would require legal determination. Lady Ashford, having been truthful regarding her movements and her discovery of Eleanor's body, was similarly exonerated from criminal charges, though the emotional and social consequences of the evening's revelations would persist far beyond any legal resolution. Mr. Thorpe was formally charged with Eleanor Fairfax's murder. The trial, when it occurred several months later, would dominate village conversation for years to come. Not because of its sensational nature, but because it illuminated the quiet desperation that could motivate even ostensibly respectable individuals to commit acts of violence in service to the preservation of social order. Miss Marple, standing in Thornfield Manor's garden on the evening following Thorpe's arrest, reflected upon the case with the particular contemplation that followed the revelation of human complexity. The roses had begun to fade as autumn approached, their petals gradually loosening and falling to the ground below. She thought of Eleanor Fairfax, whose longing for acknowledgement and reconciliation had precipitated her own destruction. She thought of Caroline, whose desperate attempt to protect her family had inadvertently shielded a murderer. And she thought of Mr. Thorpe, whose commitment to the Ashford family's interests had ultimately manifested itself in the violation of the fundamental principle that society presumed to uphold, the sanctity of human life. "You were correct about everything," Inspector Thornton observed, approaching Miss Marple with the humility of a man who had learned to respect her particular methodology. "From the beginning, you perceived the truth that others overlooked." "I perceived only what human nature inevitably reveals," Miss Marple replied gently, "when we take sufficient time to observe it carefully." Eleanor returned seeking acknowledgement. Caroline acted seeking protection. Mr. Thorpe intervened seeking preservation. And you, Inspector, pursued justice seeking clarity. In the end, we all received precisely what we sought, though not, perhaps, in the manner we had anticipated. As twilight descended upon Little Ashford, the village gradually returned to its customary rhythms. The scandal would fade, as scandals invariably do. Life would resume its comfortable patterns. Yet those who had lived through the events of that fateful June afternoon would carry with them the understanding that beneath every peaceful surface, beneath every carefully maintained reputation, human beings harbored secrets sufficient to transform ordinary afternoons into extraordinary tragedies. And Miss Marple, setting down her knitting with a soft sigh, understood that this lesson, the recognition of human complexity concealed behind social convention, was perhaps the most important truth that anyone could ever learn.